Historicism, from dominance to crisis. Historicism's prominent role. The period of peace expected after 1918 turned out to be short and politically turbulent. Defeat caused bitterness and victory disappointment. In the 1920s, the great gap between post-war hopes and expectations, even outright illusions, and life's realities in a reorganized political world put obstacles in the way of a proper adjustment of historiography. In Europe, old political entities were dissolved and new ones constructed, often without the consent of substantial segments of the population. Resentments, even hatreds, were kindled and rekindled with tragic consequences. In the end, most European nations ended up impoverished. The hardships of the Great Depression of the 1930s added their measure to an already difficult situation. Historians encountered difficulties when they attempted, correspondingly, to build new historical nexuses in various national contexts. The reassessment of what constituted a true and usable national history in light of the decisive upheavals of the immediate past proved the key problem. The attendant social, political, and cultural implications made dealing with the issues of continuity and change a public affair. To historians in the academy, who by then had gained the authoritative voice on historical matters in most of the European countries at the time, fell the task of reassessment, done in terms of the prevailing mainstream historiography. That continuity was assured by the fact that pre-war historians still held key positions in academy. It also mattered that the organization of the historical enterprise, such as the institutions, the education of historians, and the standards of enforcement, showed a good deal of continuity. With continuity came a strong position for historicism, and hence why it was relevant that historicism came to be troubled by an acute crisis caused, as was seen before, by its inherent relativism. The scope of the crisis. Three problems did pose specific difficulties for historicists: the uncertain status of general pronouncements about individual and unique phenomena, also the danger of subjectivity in all matters of truth, and then, of course, the moral neutrality fostered by the purely contextual nature of all values. And, of course, the problem inhibited by the development of different types of history. The second settled historicism with an uninhibited relativism, and the third deprived historicism of a more than contextual truth when confronted with grand ideologies, a severe handicap in circumstances that demanded moral choices. Of course, the issue of truth about the past and its moral implications became an increasing issue in the 1920s and the 1930s, and particularly that in Germany. But beginning with Dilthey, German scholars had striven to establish history at a safe distance from both the natural sciences and metaphysical entities, such as deities. They retained, however, the idealist conviction that the autonomy of history as a discipline called for the unique individual, group, or event to remain at the center. The price of abjuring generalizations and of ignoring forces on a larger scale was the denial of any overall development in history and the loss of an objectively ordered world which could be understood in its totality. Of course, while all that disturbed few people in the tranquil atmosphere of pre-1914 Germany, the horrors of World War I, or the Great War as it was known in its day, reduced the willingness to be satisfied with Dilthey's despite it all optimism, and Weber's stoic acceptance of a world as basically incomprehensible could not hide the problem. Thus, the search for a concept of an ordered world and the adequate methods of understanding that world continued, always on guard against positivist certainties, as well as their opposite, the relativist denial of the possibility of a binding truth. A few German scholars were willing to follow historical relativism to its radical conclusion, but in the midst of the Great War, Theodor Lessing drew the last consequence of a human world without intrinsic order when he pronounced history to be no science at all, but in fact a creative act which gave meaning to meaningless life. All views of the past were myths created by people who wished to engender faith and hope in the future. The idea of a scientific history was just another such myth, since only the realm of nature yielded such truth which could be expressed in firm propositions or even in numbers and mathematics. Others attacked the last vestiges of a rational cognition which Max Weber had preserved. Karl Mannheim viewed even the rational processes not as autonomous, but as shaped by economic, social, and political conditions, making even scientific theories into ideologies, while Erich Rothacker knew only the logic of life, unique with each individuality and with no universal validity. But in the period after 1918, with its profound political and cultural changes and uncertainties, most historians were now disturbed by a question Dilthey had once asked only rhetorically. Did not the view of all religious and philosophical ideas as changing and subjective lead inevitably to an anarchy of convictions? Despite historicism's relativistic inclinations, German historians still discerned in the multitude of individual perspectives the presence of eternal varieties of the good and of the true. But Ernst Troeltsch found such aestheticism no match for the prevailing relativism. He rather hoped that a synthesis of values could provide a firm basis for living and for writing history with a solid order. In 1932, 1 year before Hitler came to power, Karl Hussey published his The Crisis of Historicism, the reconciliation of the general with the individual, as well as of change with continuity, had failed, and in practice relativistic historicism failed as well, as it found no real answer to Hitler's totalitarian state. Friedrich Meinecke, in his book on historicism, tried to redefine German history and character in the image of the neoclassical ideal of Humanitat that German thinkers had cherished in the period between 1750 and 1890, although he knew that giving such prominence to one age and its views violated the no age was superior to any other doctrine of historicism. During the 1920s and the 1930s, the German defenders of history's truth value could have turned to Benedetto Croce for some assistance. He too wished to defend history against those who would convert history into a science. Indeed, he ended up with an endorsement of history as the all-embracing view of the world. Whether he overcame the relativism that bothered the German historicists so much depended on one's acceptance or rejection of Croce's view of human life as onrushing, ever-creative process. In that stood the historian as a full participant, necessarily so as a human being, who still could be impartial through scholarly discipline, but not objective in the sense of having no views on the world. The latter attitude produced historians who shut themselves up within the four walls of their private affections and private economic life, ceased to be interested in what has happened and what is happening in the great world, and they recognized no other history but that of their limited anxieties. That made all history contemporary history, because the present was no mere point in time from which historians could look back at a finished project or finished past. Rather, the present and the past were linked inextricably. The past existed in present reality. Historians therefore had to redefine their task. It was not the collection and critical assessment of sources as facts on which to build an interpretation, which was the Rankian approach, or even general laws, the positivist approach, but the incorporation into the present of a living past. That task would produce history's narrative and character, reflecting the uniqueness of specific historical contexts, empathetic in spirit, thus obviating the need to judge in terms of good and evil. Such histories would demonstrate how at every instant human achievements were accomplished only to be overcome by doubts about them. Problems were reborn and solved again by new achievements, and so life proceeded. In Croce's understanding, life and history were one, the one incomprehensible without the other. Records, sources, events were meaningless outside of life, and without historical reflection, life would make no sense. Thus, embedded in a consistent philosophical scheme, Croce's historicism forestalled those curious doubts of German historicists, and with its affirmative spirit appealed to two American historians, that of Carl Becker and that by the name of Charles Beard. A joyous relativism. American historians, notwithstanding the influence of German historical science, did not share the German agony over history's access to truth. They remained absent of angst and convinced that scientific history would eventually bring reliable and valid results. This confidence rested on their rejection of the German doubts that reality could be grasped in a subject-order separation conducted according to strict methodological rules. The conviction that reality could be represented as it was in historical accounts even marked progressive history when its dynamic principle, that of progress, was seen not as a construct but as a fact. Indeed, objectivity was defined as viewing history in terms of progress. Therefore, James R. Robinson saw no conflict between the ideals of a scientific history with timeless insights and the view of history as a tool for action. He emphasized the fact that history should not be regarded as a stationary subject which could only progress by refinishing its methods and accumulating, criticizing, and assimilating new material, but that it is bound to alter its ideas and aims with the general progress of society and of the social sciences. Robinson and the progressive historians considered such a relativity harmless, since they trusted that each subsequent stage would be more rational and democratic, and therefore each subsequent historical truth would be more accurate. Hence the ideal of, hey guys, no, you're fine. Hence the ideal of objectivity did not prescribe a deliberate and contemplative standing back for assessing matters, but involved the affirmation of that view which was in accord with progress. That historical insights will forever be invalidated when the period which produced them passes did not matter, since both the period and the insights will have helped to bring about something better. Thus, relativism had that caused epistemological agony to European historians, and it sounded a joyful note in the United States because it demonstrated that progress proceeded unimpeded. Harry Elmer Barnes celebrated the vanishing of the traditional concept of truth as a great victory over pietism, obscurantism, and political fetishism. Only a few American historians, among them Carl L. Becker and Charles Beard, engaged in a more serious discussion of historical objectivity and truth. Both men realized that World War I, the new physics, and the Great Depression had shaken faith in progress as an inevitable aspect of reality, and thus had destroyed the easy connection between progress and objectivity. Progress, so far considered to be the structural force in historical reality, now became a construct either by society or by individual historians. Becker, who once had believed it possible to capture the real past, had begun in 1910 to become skeptical about that possibility. After all, the historian cannot deal directly with this event itself, since the event itself has disappeared. What he can deal with directly is a statement about the event. There is thus a distinction of capital importance to be made, the distinction between the ephemeral event which disappears and the affirmation about the event which persists. For all practical purposes, it is this affirmation about the event that constitutes for us the historical fact. History as depiction of the actual past was an illusion. Becker put a cheerful face on his skepticism. All historical interpretations with a long range were declared to be neither true nor false, but only more or less useful. They were myths, that is, with no foundations in rational arguments or procedures. Historians had to tend the prevailing myths, or every man's historical interpretations, especially casting them into more attractive, that is, more useful forms. In Every Man His Own Historian, he set forth the theoretical framework for his view, and in The Heavenly City of the 18th century philosophers, he demonstrated the transformation of one myth, that of Christianity, into another, rationalism of the Enlightenment. Charles Beard remained affirmative and optimistic even when he too said goodbye to the ideal of objectivity in his essay entitled That Noble Dream. Beard denied that the past could be grasped as an external object, that historians could face it with impartiality, that the multitude of events had any inner structure, and that the past could be intellectually conquered by man. The subject matter of history is so charged with values that historians themselves cannot avoid making judgments when they select and arrange facts for their accounts. And while it is almost a confession of inexplicable sin to admit in academic circles that one is not a man of science working in a scientific manner with things open to deterministic and inexorable treatment, one must do so and face boldly the wreck of matter and the crush of worlds. It was also the wreck of Beard's once strong conviction that history should be a science in the positivist mold. But if a historical view was only the product of a specific period, class, group, nation, race, or region, a view to be devoured by change, what then was truth and what was the meaning of history? Beard thought that historians had a choice among three views. History is chaos, and anything attempt to interpret it otherwise is an illusion. History moves around in a cycle. History moves in a line, straight, or spiral, or in some direction. Neither objectivity nor positivistic science could assist historians in making their choices. Of course, the historian may seek to escape these issues by silence or by a confession of avoidance, or he may face them boldly, aware of the intellectual and moral perils inherent in any decision in his act of faith. Beard's own act of faith affirmed that history had a direction. It aimed at fulfilling the American dream of a just and democratic society. In Beard's interpretation of a society of a planned and collectivist nature, everything in the past must be judged against this. It was this reaffirmation of progress towards an absolute good, now entirely dependent on human choices, that made American historiographical relativism so bearable. When the new historians or progressive historians spoke in a relativist vein, they could do so with joy and optimism, because in the end, progress, either self-propelled by humans or resulting from human actions and ideas, provided a sense of security and truth. In fact, Beard never practiced his relativism consistently. His works of the 1930s on behalf of the reform of American society were argued in a sturdily positivist manner, including a progress considered to be part of the actual structure of reality. Then, in the ideological struggles after 1936, both Beard and Becker veered away from a genuinely relativistic interpretation of history, which could give little support to the defense of liberal democracy. They found new certainties in the American tradition, especially that of Becker, and in the unique American civilization, especially that of Beard. But neither man had enough time left to work out the implications of his new stance. Progressive history's relativist phase was brief and did not lead to a thorough epistemological debate in American historiography. Only a few scholars, notably Maurice Mandelbaum, subjected the theoretical foundation of American historical relativism to a substantial critical review. Historians and the War Guild debate. About the proper historical thought and practice, significant as it was and largely was confined to the academic world, another debate, not at all unrelated to the first one, was conducted in the public sphere. Historicist historians found the debate after the First World War on the responsibility for what were quite congenial to their views, since its focus on diplomats, statesmen, and military commanders affirmed the individual as the historical agent. A wealth of archival material provided source material for analyzing decisions and actions, yet forces that went beyond the scope of the individual, be they social, economic, technological, or geopolitical, remained invisible. Historians became engaged in the peacemaking process, but even more so in the subsequent debate on the so-called War Guild question. Which power or group of powers led the world into war? Historians in many countries lent their skills to what they thought was a good cause. National mindset prevailed in the accounts of the road to war, and the fault lines of the war were preserved. German, Austrian, French, and English historians engaged in editing and publishing documents designed to justify their government's actions in the year 1914. Archives were made accessible earlier than usual for that purpose. George Gooch, Harold W. Temperley, and James W. Headland Morley's British document on the origin of the war presented the British view. Émile Bourgeois and Georges Paget's Origines et la responsabilité de la Grande Guerre, 1921, did the same for the French cause. Yet a few voices critical of the simple condemnation of Germany could soon be heard. In England, such a revision was suggested by Harold Nicholson and the older Gooch. In France, it came more indirectly from the works of Pierre Renouvin and Henry Hauser, who each saw the war in a wider perspective, thereby making the War Guild question itself a more complex question. The German response did not differ in the kind of historiography produced, but was especially bitter as it came in the context of military defeat, the collapse of the monarchical state, and the deep resentment of the conditions of the Versailles Peace Treaty. Especially relevant was Article 231 that forced Germany to state that it was the sole responsible party for the war. Counter-arguments came from the Zentralstelle für Erforschung der Kriegsursachen, the Center for Research on the Causes of the War. But the most substantial debate on the issue of the war occurred in the context of the discussion about the new German identity. In it, the main result of the war was at stake: the democratic German state, the Weimar Republic. The United States was spared a strident War Guilt debate, as the origin of the war could not possibly be found in American actions. The debate focused on the circumstances of and justification for the American intervention in the Great War. There, too, it was conducted in the historicist vein, stressing diplomatic, political, and military history. Many of the historians who engaged in the debate had actively supported the war effort through the National Board of Historical Service. among them James T. Shotwell and Albert B. Hart, and a few had participated in the peacemaking process. But after 1925, some studies were critical of attributing the guilt solely to Germany. Among them were those by Harry Elmer Barnes's The Genesis of the World War, published in 1927, Sidney Fay's Origins of the World War, 1929, and Bernadotte Schmidt's The Coming of the War, 1914, published in 1930. In them, objections were voiced to the narrow framework of the debate. Economic, social, and cultural considerations came into play in works by C.J. H. Hayes, Parker T. Moon, Preston Slauson, and Edward R. Turner. For all of them, the pre-war debate, roughly described as the one between isolationists and interventionists, provided the central theme of the American version of the war guilt debate. Two other countries escaped the war guilt debate for other reasons. In Italy, the course of events left only 4 years between the end of the war and the seizure of power by the Italians under Mussolini. Being among the victors, the issues of war guilt was of lesser importance than Italy's unhappiness with the gains from the war, and the Soviet Union, setting out to construct an entirely new state for an envisioned new era of humanity, considered the world of the past as a part of the vanishing and totally flawed old order. Marxist orthodoxy offered an explanation for wars in the capitalist world that made specific war guilt questions completely irrelevant.